Welcome, comrades and friends, to this meeting, No Life Like It, a tribute to the revolutionary activism of Ernie Tate. My name is James Clark. I use the pronouns he and him, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. I'm joining you from Toronto, Canada, along with many of you in the meeting, which is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Others in the meeting are joining from the traditional lands of other Indigenous nations in Turtle Island and from around the world. Toronto, or Tekaronto, is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that binds them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. It is in this spirit that we gather for today's tribute to Ernie Tate. And in light of the horrific news we heard this week about the discovery of a mass grave at a residential school at Kamloops, British Columbia, we acknowledge the ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples in these lands and recommit our unconditional solidarity to their continuing resistance. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today for this very important event. Before we introduce our first video and list of invited speakers, I would like to acknowledge and welcome a very special guest, Jess Mackenzie. Jess is a lifelong revolutionary socialist, feminist, and activist in her own right, and was Ernie's companion and comrade for more than half a century. Jess has been central to planning and organizing today's tribute and will open the tribute with some remarks of her own. Jess, please go ahead.
Welcome and thank you for joining me in this celebration of Ernie's life. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Thanks to all of you who wrote and telephoned after Ernie died and sent cards. I greatly appreciate your words. Each of the speakers is connected with Ernie through the years and participated with him in various political activities such as demonstrations, strikes, conferences, campaigns, defense committees, union work, and building left groups. Thanks for sharing your memories with us. Many of you have known us as a couple since 1966, and some of the attendees here knew Ernie earlier than that. Ernie wrote about his life in his memoir and was happy he had taken the time to do that. The feedback and reviews were positive. We would say to each other, the books keep giving back to us. So thanks to Resistance Books, Duncan Chappell, Derek O'Keefe, and Lawrence Boxall for their support in that process. Ernie couldn't resist the opportunity for a kick at the system when we learned of the British Undercover Policing Inquiry into police infiltration of the anti-Vietnam War protests and many other organizations on the left. And Tariq suffered horribly from this later. Richard, Nick, and Rajiv, our London legal team, presented our case, and Ernie's memoir is now part of the official record. In 2019 and 2020, responding to the many questions posed by the inquiry, we relived our time in London really in the 60s. Nick Stanage, I believe, is going to be on the call. I must say that the London years, pivotal and exciting, changed us both politically. After a few years building a branch in Vancouver and then 4 years in London, with that experience Ernie had, the people he met, and the many discussions with leading comrades, Ernie became an independent thinker in the revolutionary movement, to my mind. As a revolutionary couple, we were a team and we enjoyed activities together, from bird watching, photography, learning Spanish, opera, woodworking, and of course, most importantly, politics. As you can see on the shelves behind me, we have an extensive library, and Ernie kept current by reading everything he could. Our life together was never dull, always stimulating, and Ernie had no regrets about it at all. A big thank you to those who helped to put this event together. Tanner, James, Pam, Greg, Suzanne, John, and Alex Lismer. Without their generous time, patience, and advice, this event would not have happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jess, for those beautiful words and for those acknowledgements and thanks. I'll also like to acknowledge and thank all the people and organizations who helped make today's event possible, starting, of course, with Jess Mackenzie. I'd also like to thank the co-sponsors of the event today, the Socialist Project, the Center for Social Justice, Spring Magazine, Socialist Resistance, Green Left Weekly, and Socialist Viewpoint. I'm going to explain briefly how this event will unfold today. We're going to hear from a number of invited speakers who are joining us from all over the world. And we're also going to have a number of video and audio clips from other guest speakers who couldn't be with us in person today. So the first part of the agenda today, we're going to start with Ernie. We're going to see a video clip from the 2014 book launch of his book, his 2-volume memoir, which many of you know and have read, Revolutionary Activism in the 1950s and 60s. And this clip is going to give you a sense of some of the political lessons that Ernie was generalizing at the time and are certainly urgent for our movements today. So I'll hand it over to Tanner to play the video.
If you look at what the Canadians did when the Cuban Revolution developed, it was a remarkable thing. And we should learn something from this, because it's remarkable. We as a relatively small organization, here we took on this tremendous task of trying to find breathing space for that revolution, trying to find room for it so that it could talk to people in its own language and not have the imperialists and their propaganda things drown it out. And the Canadian experience in the Fair Play for Cuba and with Fair Play for Cuba is one of those proud experiences, really part of the history of the working class of Canada. Because what we did was a minute, because the working class responded. We had tremendous results in the West Coast, the BC Federation of Labour. To this day, there's a long friendliness among Canadian working people towards Cuba. That's it. And we helped. Don't think we decided that. But as someone said in the course of the evening, there was nothing like this in the English-speaking world. The Americans had one, but ours was, what we did here lasted longer, had a broader reach, was non-sectarian, and I thought and it's something to learn. And what I think we should try and learn is the methodology we use, the non-sectarian methodology, where you try to work with all those forces. You don't demand agreement and everything. You approach them with a certain integrity, a certain confidence that you're going to be loyal to them and not pull the rug out from them or do nasty things to them. That methodology was critical in that. And that basically is what we used. That was our template for our work against the Vietnam War. And it's what we did in Britain. I mean, that motivated me.
Thank you, Tanner, for playing that clip. I'm sure that brings back lots of memories for everyone who was at that event. And thank you to all the comrades who organized Ernie's book launch. We're now going to turn to the speakers, the invited guest speakers for the event. And our first speaker today will be Bryan Palmer. A friend who learned much from Ernie, Bryan is an historian of labor and the left. He has written widely on Canadian working class history and talked extensively with Ernie while researching and writing his study of James P. Cannon, founder of American Trotskyism. Bryan's second volume in this project, James P. Cannon and the Emergence of Trotskyism in the United States, 1928 to 38, will be published later this summer and is dedicated to Ernie. Please welcome Bryan. Bryan, please go ahead.
Thank you very much to Tanner and James, to John Riddell and Jess in particular, and many, many others who invited me to talk today. It's really an honor to be here honoring Ernie, a friend to all of you, I think, today, a comrade to many, a revolutionary socialist. Revolutionary socialists as a group have a reputation, very much deserved, for being critical. They are, of course, critical of capitalism, which they abhor, its exploitation, its myriad oppressions. They are, of course, critical of the bourgeoisie that rides this capitalism to its self-interest, and particularly in our times, in ways that have become increasingly obvious and more egregious and repugnant. They are also revolutionary socialists, critical of all those who rationalize, support, and sustain capitalism. And they are as well critical of themselves. We all know this. Ernie embraced this penchant for criticism, but did so in, as the brief clip revealed, in non-sectarian ways. He was often himself on the receiving end of criticism from the far left, including, I would say, among some of those myself at certain times. The amazing thing about Ernie was, I have never heard anyone who may have been critical at times of Ernie's politics, who actually was critical of Ernie personally. I've never heard anyone who didn't accept that the criticisms that they might have had of Ernie and his political positions were criticisms that were a part of the struggle to create a revolutionary socialist possibility. Everyone that I know on the left regarded Ernie as the genuine item, as a revolutionary socialist of integrity, of principle, who behaved methodologically as he talked in that brief clip you saw, in principled ways, and in ways that were devoted to bringing about that better world that we all know is possible. He never relinquished, nor did he ever repudiate, the need for revolutionary socialism and the defeat of capitalism, which he was always deeply angered by. He never repudiated nor relinquished the necessity of a disciplined party of the working class and the role that this had to play in the struggle for a better world. And he recognized always the value of a variety of different social movements and causes and struggles for justice, without ever losing sight of the significance of the class struggle. And in all of this, Ernie was a part of the continuity, I would argue, of revolutionary Trotskyism. And the lessons he learned about this came from his schooling in the Canadian Trotskyist and the International Trotskyist movement. He was recruited by Ross Dowson, who was a major figure in the history of Canadian Trotskyism. The lessons he learned from Ross, largely positive, but also some negative, were always put forward in a balanced way. There was no hint of bitterness. The title of this, I think, tribute, No Life Like It, reflects the fact, as Jess said, that Ernie never, ever regretted being a part of the revolutionary socialist movement. I am going to leave to others who were far more familiar with Ernie in particular kinds of struggles, and in particular organizations and movements, to talk about the specificities that they can relate to with respect to Ernie. I've talked a bit about these in some of the things I've written about him, but today I want to focus on a more general kind of appreciation of Ernie, and which seems fitting in trying to kick things off. And I want to start and return to, throughout these brief remarks, the communards of 1871. Their maxim was, everything is in everything. Now, what that meant was that they had a totalizing vision, an integral practice, a sensibility of the connectedness of all things involved in their struggle to create a better world. And this was Ernie Tate's fundamental, I think, essence as well. In his anti-capitalism, in his revolutionary socialism, he did actually incorporate this notion that everything is in everything. The struggle was always, even in its most particular and specific, about the totality and generality of human transformation that is fundamental to the socialist project. And this is why his life was full of meaning. in which his successes, which were large, as well as his failures, which were sometimes large, were destined to educate and teach us all and bring us all to better places. Everything is in everything. The struggle for revolutionary socialism, I think, for Ernie, opened out into not just politics, although politics was obviously at the center of it, but into poetry, into art, into film, into culture, into opera and music, into people and their endless passions. This socialist movement was Ernie's schooling and his vocation. He made his waged work into a nursery of possibility in which new men and women could be created in ongoing struggles. Everything is in everything. And whatever he turned his hand to, Ernie did it well. He organized mobilizations. He renovated a house. He wrote articles in books. He built a cottage. He sold newspapers, and he made socialists. He led his local union, and he enjoyed life to the fullest. Now, others, as I said, will speak of Ernie and their particular experiences. To me, Ernie exemplified that communard's precept: everything is in everything. Those Parisians who took to the barricades in 1871 believed in the dignity and the diversity of work. They believed in the fusion of aesthetics and action, of politics and art, and of bringing a decrepit bourgeois order to its end. Ernie was made of the same kind of stuff, and it allowed him a life like no other. Marx's favorite adage, "nothing human is alien to me," seemed from my encounters with Ernie to encapsulate a large part of what he too was all about. It was his openness and his generosity, combined with his principle, his integrity, and his rigor, that made him the socialist and revolutionary that he was. Now I'm going to end, and not with wishing Ernie a rest in peace or even in power, the sort of, I think, favored ways of phrasing this in our time. I think Ernie knew well that there will be no peace until we revolutionary socialists indeed do have power. And he understood that we are a very long, long way from that. He knew that there was no rest for the wicked. And with Ernie's death, we've lost a wicked good comrade. We can thank Ernie for his life by making more of such comrades, by building the kinds of struggles, mobilizations, and movements that Ernie devoted his life and his creative abilities to sustaining. And we can rest, I think, in part as we do this, on Ernie's example. It's a legacy of socialist possibility in which everything is in everything. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker will be Judy Rebick. Judy has been active as a socialist and as a feminist since the early 1970s and was a central figure in the fight for abortion rights in Canada in the 1980s and 90s. In 2018, Judy published her powerful and courageous memoir, Heroes in My Head, which partly formed the basis of the award-winning 2020 documentary, Judy versus Capitalism, directed by the acclaimed Canadian filmmaker, Mike Holboom. Judy, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see all the names of old comrades. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Jess and everyone else who organized it for asking me to speak. I feel honored also. And I've been thinking a lot about what I want to say about Ernie. And my Jewishness has been in the front burner the last few weeks because of what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And so the word that came to me is minch. It's a Yiddish word. And there's no word like that in English, but what it means is a really good person. It means a minch is someone who does good in their lives, who's generous to people, who's caring, just a really, really good person. And that's how I think of Ernie. You know, I don't remember when I first met Ernie because at that time I was in the Revolutionary Marxist Group and he was in the League for Socialist Action. And we had, I think the word contempt perhaps is not overstating how we as a kind of new left Trotskyist group felt about these old people. which is how we saw them, right? They were, 10, 15 years older than us. But Ernie, he never acted that way toward us. And, you have to remember, if you go back to the early 70s, and I was a pretty young woman, and he was, I guess, what he'd be in his late 30s, and I'd be in my 20s. And, I had a fight to be treated with respect by most men in those days, right? But never by Ernie. Ernie always had respect for women. When I think about this, of his generation, and John Riddell also is like this, from his generation, it's the only two men I remember, older men in my life, who really treated me fully with respect, who recognized my talents and my ability, who never was sexist, never. That I mean, maybe Jess has seen it, but I haven't, not in all the years I've known him. And that is extraordinary. It really is extraordinary. And the other thing about Ernie is he was, as Bryan has said, he was so generous and so non-sectarian. And again, in those old days in the left, I mean, it's better now, not that much better, but in those old days, people were really vicious to each other, even inside the same organization when there were faction fights. A few years ago, when I was organizing a move, I looked at some of the documents of debates that we had, and this is inside the RMG or the RWL, and they were just savage debates, angry, vicious people were to each other. And now I can barely even understand what the difference was, And so we had this, you say, in those days, it was like, I'm right and you're wrong, and that was the debate. But Ernie never was like that. He always had he argued his position. I'm not saying he didn't, he always argued his position, but he was never, he always focused on the agreement and with kindness spoke about the differences. And, for people who are around younger people, I think it's hard to understand how unusual that was, how extraordinary that was. That he was a feminist, he was generous, he was non-sectarian. And the last thing I want to say is he was humble. Like, until I read his book, I had no idea of all the things he'd done in his life and what a major role he played in England and other places. And I was completely stunned. Like, where do you find in those days a man who doesn't brag about his accomplishments, or at least talk about them? He didn't even talk about them. And so he had a humility which was incredible. And so that's what I want to say. I think others will talk more about his role in political movements and all that. I want to talk about him as a human being. He was one of the most beautiful, kind, generous, wonderful people I've ever known in my life. And I know I will, even though I didn't see him often, usually just at meetings, which we don't have anymore, or demonstrations, but I will miss his presence because he was such a wonderful person. And I feel happy that he was at least part of my life for some time. And I thank Jess and him and however he turned out to be the way he is. He was I don't like to use the word blessing usually because I don't believe in blessing, but somehow it's the word that came to me. He was a blessing for all of us. So thank you.
Our next speaker will be Tariq Ali. Tariq is a writer and filmmaker. He has written more than 24 books on world history and politics and 7 novels translated into over a dozen languages, as well as scripts for the stage and for the screen. He's an editor of New Left Review and lives in London. Please welcome Tariq. Tariq, please go ahead.
Very nice to be with all of you comrades. And it's what Jess said at the beginning that I agree with very strongly. And I felt that the first time I met Ernie, which was that he was basically a non-sectarian. Even before he officially became one, there was a non-sectarian side to him. And I noticed this very early on. When I first arrived in Britain, we were spoiled for choice. There was an embarrassment of riches, 4 to 5 Trotskyist groups. Who could want more? And then you studied these groups closely. One didn't believe there'd been a socialist revolution in Cuba. This was the largest group. It was, as Edward Thompson described it in one of his footnotes, a stunted opposite of Stalinism, the way it operated. And the couple I met who were friends, when I discovered what group they were in, that's how I discovered or noticed this group. They were weeping on one of the occasions I met them, and I said, what's happened? And they said, we've been ordered by the Central Committee to break up. So that was one group, which one could discard. Another group had very nice people in it, but they didn't believe that there'd been a socialist revolution in China, in Cuba, in Vietnam. And coming from a continent where these things were very important, especially the Chinese revolution and the Vietnamese struggle, I was just sort of struck by the Eurocentrism of it all and the way of thinking, which seemed to me to be incredibly schematic. There's another group which was so deeply embedded in an imperialist Labour Party that it was sometimes difficult to find them. And then there was a small group, a very tiny group, with which I came into contact through the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation, through the plans to set up a Vietnam War Crimes Tribunal, and after that to create the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. And it was in the context of these movements, anti-imperialist movements, that I first met Ernie and Pat Jordan. And I think it was about a year and a half later at Berlin that Ernest Mandel said to me, well, you know, why don't you join the IMG, the International Marxist Group? So I said, they're the ones I feel the most sympathetic to because they are internationalists. And for me, that's extremely important. And I just said, by the way, how many members do they have? And Ernest, characteristically optimistic, said, oh, about 100, 200. So I said, well, okay, fine. I mean, I didn't care. When I came back and had lunch with Ernie and Pat, who carried through the formal recruitment, I said, you know, how many members are there in London? I said, Ernest said, you've got 100, 200. I'm not bothered. I just like to know. And Ernie burst out laughing. And he said, I think we might have 20 to 30 in Nottingham and less than that in London. And he mentioned 4 other cities where there was a single member each. So I said, they said, you know, Ernest gets carried away. And so that was the beginning of a long friendship and comradeship with Ernie. And we were very upset, actually, a lot of us, my generation in particular, when Ernie and Jess were recalled back to Canada. I mean, I have to put it like that because I don't think it was voluntary. They were called back to Canada. And we missed him a great deal. And in later years, as the IMG began to disintegrate, one really wished that Ernie and Jess had been there to help Pat and others from our generation to make sure that the group wasn't completely destroyed by a group of sectarians, but he wasn't there. And so one always missed that. And, you know, tragically, the people he was, the couple who replaced Ernie and Jess, you know, central casting didn't do a very good job there. They were just, I mean, they meant well probably, but they were pretty depressing. No independence of thought, just carrying out orders coming from the SWP headquarters or the LSA headquarters. And not capable really of creating a broad-based movement. And that Ernie was very strong on. And as he said himself, and as Jess has hinted at, linking up with the tradition of European Trotskyism, Mandel, Pierre Frank, Livio Maitan, etc., it did have a big impact on him. And it changed him in many ways, and he remained that. for most of his life. I mean, I used to go to Canada quite often and never met him as much as I should have in the 70s. I was mainly, I did speak at some LSA meetings, but I was mainly involved in helping the RMG, who, as Judy has pointed out, were much closer to us in temperament, in politics, in ways of operating, in culturally and politically. So I unfortunately missed Ernie a bit in those days, and then contact was renewed fortuitously after 9/11, when I began to make lots of trips all over and went to Canada several times in different cities. And in Toronto, I always met Ernie and Jess. The last time I went a few years ago, they weren't in town, which upset me, because that would have been the last time I actually met him. Now, of course, how he would have faced up, how we will all face up to the challenges that confront us is an open question. The world has changed, and there has to be a lucid registration of a huge defeat that the workers' movement, that the revolutionary movement, that the left in general has suffered. And we sort of tend to cling on to anything. And it's good, all these movements that erupt, but they are all movements within the ambit of capitalism. And you have a form of apolitical anti-capitalism, which is quite dominant. I'm glad it's there, but it's not all that political. And Marxism itself has atrophied a bit, to put it at its mildest, and is being caught up and trapped in the academies. I think this is the first time since the Communist Manifesto was written, almost in world history, where Marxism isn't related to a living movement. There are no big political parties in which it functions. There are small groups, but they're not so effective. I'm very glad they exist, but they are not so effective. And so the challenges that face Marxists and the left in general on that level of what practice, what theory, how, why, remain questions that we have to tackle. Jess mentioned our last contact, where Ernie was very ill and already in a bad way, but almost came back to life to fight against the revelations that we'd all been spied on for God knows how many years. In my case, they said I'd been spied on by 14 different policed people over 45 years. I mean, as I said at the inquiry, and as I'm sure Ernie would have had he been with us, what's the point of spying on us? I mean, I said to the judge who asked a couple, I said, there's very little I said in private that I didn't say in public. There's no big conspiracy to topple the British state going on inside the IMG or most of the far left groups, even the most sort of paranoid and idiotic ones among them. No one was plotting that because the objective conditions were very different, quite honestly. So I said, why were they spying on us? And reply, we'll see when the report finally comes out. And at the end, the judge said, actually, the police lawyers have been questioning you. I'd like to ask you a question. Did Trotskyism, it's quite funny thinking about it now, sort of senior British judge carrying out an official inquiry, saying, did Trotskyism come close to capturing power anyway? I said, unfortunately not, but we were mainly influential with political movements, except in Sri Lanka, where the Trotskyists became the largest, nationalist party in opposition, by nationalist in the sense fighting imperialism and creating an opposition to the bourgeoisie. I thought best not to point out that they had been expelled by the Fourth International for breaking discipline on the Tamil question, and rightly so when you see what's happening in Sri Lanka. And I told the judge about Pablo's activities in Algeria, which quite interested him, about, you know, the advice given to Ben Bella, etc., to point out that you don't have to win power in that sense to be effective. You can do it in other ways. And the most important thing, I think, which the Trotskyist movement, speaking in the broadest possible sense, did was actually challenge the hegemony of social democracy and the warped Stalinism, pre-56 Stalinism that was so dominant intellectually and theoretically, which also helped to produce the new left. And Ernie's books, as Jess said, came in very handy at that particular court hearing. And the questions they asked were just, the police lawyers, the questions they posed to us were sort of completely banal, stupid, ignorant. I more or less said this. I said, what are you asking about? I mean, why are you asking such stupid questions? And later they said the police asked us to ask them off the record. That's what I was told. So what do we learn from Ernie is that in good times and bad, be true to yourself. Don't give up, but don't do anything that is, you know, not linked to something that isn't going on. And here Ernie was very strong. I missed him last time in Toronto, but I went to dinner with a group of young lawyers and friends, many of whom were friends of Ernie. So we spent quite a part of the evening talking about him. And I said, how did you meet him? And they told me. And they described how they'd met him, how he had been so educated for them, telling them about labor movement history, not just in Canada, but elsewhere in the world, and full of admiration. And this was a generation, I mean, 2 generations below us, people in their 30s and 40s. So you know, just listening to them talk about Ernie was in itself a very great, a real delight. And it also, you know, brought back that and the hearing, the early days of the IMG, the meetings we had, building the anti-war movement, really. I mean, that was one of, in my opinion, the most important things done by the Fourth International, the Mandel, Maitan, Frank Fourth International, was to build a movement in solidarity with the Vietnamese. That did have a big impact, both in Europe and, of course, in the United States, where despite differences on how to proceed, the creation of that anti-war movement marked a huge turning point for the left in the United States. It was a movement without precedent, and none like it has ever existed in the United States since, which is a pity because it's certainly needed. And as Judy mentioned, Ernie, in his level of commitment, tried to create a milieu in which everyone could participate. This was very important and is very important with the huge movements of solidarity now that are springing up with the Palestinians. I mean, but huge demonstrations in Senegal, in London, you know, last weekend we had nearly 130,000 people, which none of us were expecting. So despite, and in Brazil, you know, on virtually every continent, there were demonstrations. And so that side of Ernie, organizing in a non-sectarian way, building the largest possible platform, that is very needed today. And, you know, one can see already young people organizing in this country, in Britain and others, who are following the same track in a very different world situation, where we live in a world where you have to do what you can do. That we have to understand. We are not living in a epoch of wars and revolutions, unfortunately. We're living in an epoch, if anything, of wars and counter-revolutions. That doesn't mean you stop doing anything or that you don't remain active. You do, but careful and with thought. So here's to Ernie.
Our next speakers will be Marush and Cliff Connor. Marush and Cliff are New York comrades and friends of Ernie and Jess. Cliff has been a socialist political activist for more than 50 years and is the author of A People's History of Science and, most recently, The Tragedy of American Science. Meanwhile, Marush has been active for many years in the arts world in New York as a dancer, a dance company manager, and a New York Philharmonic volunteer. Cliff and Marush have recorded their tribute to Ernie by video. So I'll hand it over to Tanner to play the recording.
Hello, I'm Marush Connor.
And I'm Cliff Connor. We first met Jess and Ernie about 15 years ago in late 2006 at a memorial meeting for Caroline Lund. After that meeting, about 25 of the people in attendance came back to our apartment for a reception, and Ernie and Jess were among them. That's when we first made their acquaintance, but we didn't really get to know them at that time and didn't have much contact with them until 7 or 8 years later in 2014, when Marush and I went to Toronto to participate in a socialist educational conference. Ernie and Jess were at the conference promoting Ernie's recently published 2-volume memoir.
We bought the books and Cliff promised to review them. And the correspondence that followed really cemented our friendship. From that time on, we began to see them during their periodic visits to New York. And one event that really stands out in my memory was a jazz concert that we attended with other mutual friends at Birdland. And we also enjoyed our wonderful dinners with Ernie and Jess in restaurants such as Boyle, Chez Napoleon, and La Bonne Soupe. You can see how much we all enjoyed French food.
I'd actually known who Ernie was many decades earlier, from the late 1960s onward. Ernie was well known throughout the worldwide movement affiliated with the Fourth International. So when he published his memoir, I was anxious to read what he'd written about those early years. It was especially the second volume of his memoir that made it obvious to me how much Ernie and I were intellectually and politically on the same wavelength. Here's an excerpt from my review. Ernie Tate provides an insider's view of an extremely important historical event, namely the creation of the powerful anti-Vietnam War movement in Great Britain during the 1960s and early 70s. Ernie and his comrade in arms, Jess Mackenzie, were closely involved with all of these developments, and his narrative account of their battles and eventual triumphs is fascinating. What he has to say about his dealings with key figures in the anti-war, labor, and socialist movements, such as Bertrand Russell, Ralph Schoenman, David Horowitz, Isaac and Tamara Deutscher, Ernest Mandel, Vladimir Dediger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Laurent Schwartz, Tariq Ali, Ken Coates, Pat Jordan, Tony Cliff, Jerry Healy, and many more will be of immense value to historians trying to understand the great youth radicalization as it played out in Britain during those turbulent years. And speaking of David Horowitz, reminds me of a story Ernie told me once. I told him that I was impressed by how fairly I thought he had described Horowitz's positive role in the 1960s, given the fact that Horowitz later became a raving right-winger. Ernie said he happened to run into Horowitz on the street after the book came out. Horowitz had read what Ernie had written about him and was delighted that he hadn't been portrayed as a scoundrel. He cheerfully asked Ernie to have a drink with him, but Ernie said, "David, you and I are on opposite sides of the class line. I'm not having any drinks with you."
Later, Cliff enlisted Ernie's collaboration with his own writing projects, and Ernie was always very generous with his time and his advice. He read and commented on the early chapters of Cliff's book that was published last year. I think the last time we saw Ernie and Jess in person was at the Socialism 2018 conference in Chicago. As saddened as we are at Ernie's passing, it gives us great happiness to recall his kindness and his generosity.
And the example he left of a life dedicated to the fight for social justice. Thank you, Jess, for giving us this opportunity to celebrate Ernie's life. And as soon as conditions allow, we look forward to seeing you in person again.
Our next speaker will be Phil Hearse. Phil was one of many young people Ernie helped to recruit to revolutionary Marxism in the 1960s. Phil has remained a leader of the Fourth International in Britain since the 1980s. And just before Phil speaks, I will read the following message from the Fourth International to Ernie Tate Memorial Meeting, which we received just this week in advance of today's tribute. They say, "The Executive Committee of the Fourth International sends greetings to your memorial meeting and warmly salutes the memory of someone who devoted his life over more than 60 years to the struggle for socialism. Ernie was sent with his partner Jess Mackenzie from Canada to Britain in the mid-1960s to help build its British section. With Jess, he was one of the founders and central organizers of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, which became a key focus for the mass radicalization of the late 1960s. Ernie also became a central organizer of the Bertrand Russell War Crimes Tribunal, which unmasked the scope of American crimes in Vietnam, working with people like Isaac Deutscher, Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, and British miners leader Lawrence Daly. All this work went alongside the daily tasks of building a new revolutionary organization. Ernie also became part of the Fourth International leadership team based in Europe. Ernie impressed everyone with his analytical capabilities, his tactical skill, and his personal warmth, qualities that helped him in negotiating the sometimes clashing personas and political currents in the Solidarity movement. Together with Jess, never gave up his commitment to revolutionary socialism and his support for the ideas of revolutionary Marxism, which determined the course of his life since the 1950s. He was one of those people who helped revolutionary Marxism break out of the bounds of small discussion groups in the 1950s to become a significant force in the left and mass movements internationally. Thank you to the comrades in the Fourth International for that tribute. Phil, I'll now turn it over to you. Please go ahead.
So I was one of a small group of young socialists, very young socialists by today's standards, teenagers who were recruited to the IMG centrally by Ernie and Jess in the 1960s after having been expelled from the Young Communist League. Right from the very beginning, from the first time we met them, we referred to Jess and Ernie and Jess. Already they were a team. Already they were operating politically together on absolutely everything. But you have to remember that in the middle of the 1960s, we were in the midst of not just a political turmoil and upsurge, but in the middle of a cultural revolution. A cultural revolution symbolized by the music of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and so on. But it seemed to us, this little group from outer West London, that the cultural revolution had passed Ernie by. Especially in terms of Ernie's political appearance, he was the opposite of radicals like Abbie Hoffman and even people like Rudi Dutschke in Germany. He looked more like a junior executive or one of those people who come in pairs, knock on your door and ask you if you'd like to read the Book of Mormon. And he seemed also to embody something that was different from what was often the kind of sometimes frenzied radicalism of the 1960s, which you get with it, all young people when they move into action. But his approach always seemed to us to be thoughtful and ordered and careful. And his approach and his personality, I was discussing with comrades after he died, whether you could describe his personality as charismatic. And when people talk about charisma, they generally have in mind mass leaders like Malcolm X or Angela Davis. But I looked it up in the Collins Dictionary, and it said that you can describe people as charismatic if when they can attract, influence, and inspire people by their personal qualities. And even though we were talking about, at that time, relatively small groups of young people recruited to the International Marxist Group, that was exactly what Ernie could do: attract, inspire, and influence us with the ideas of Marxism through his personal warmth and through his kindness, his ability to talk to anybody, which I'll talk about in just a minute, was a function of the fact he listened to them and was genuinely interested in them. You sometimes get leaders, important leaders of the left, who are not really interested in the people that they talk to. They're only interested in people as an audience. That wasn't the case with Ernie. That was precisely the opposite. Ernie, one of the things that he always insisted upon in the 1960s and today and after 2000 was the importance that socialists, even small groups of socialists, should try to do things that influenced a mass audience, not just sit in the corner and produce a perfect program. And that was exactly what the International Marxist Group and Ernie set out to do in the 1960s, together with their collaborators internationally, in setting up the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign and the Bertrand Russell War Crimes Tribunal, together with the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation and Bertrand Russell's secretary, Ralph Sherman, who I think is on this call. I think I saw him there. But at the same time as setting up these campaigns, Ernie was involved in building the International Marxist Group and Pioneer Book Service, which operated all these things, operated out of a few offices above a Polish butcher in Toynbee Street, in a poor part, in those days, a poor part of East London. But in that place, you could meet all kinds of people. I remember in Toynbee Street, in Pioneer Book Service, they needed a book service in those days because Pluto didn't exist, Verso didn't exist. All those bookshops which have loads of radical stuff, less than a few years ago, didn't exist. People needed a special book service to get hold of a load of radical books. And I remember meeting in there Keith Dickinson, who was a member of the editorial board of The Militant, a different organization in the Labour Party, who would come there to get Trotskyist books that you couldn't get elsewhere for his organization. I bumped into John Palmer from the International Socialist in those few offices, and also Quentin Hall, at that time a member of the editorial board of the New Left Review. Ernie, in running, helping to set up the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, had to deal with all kinds of people. For example, there was a big fight in 1968 to get the South Wales miners to support the big October 68 demonstration. They were reluctant to, especially because the Communist Party was reluctant to get their members to support it. He was able to talk to people like Lawrence Daly from the National Union of Mine Workers, the editorial board of New Left Review, people like Robin Blackburn and Perry Anderson and Quentin Hall, this whole range of people, but also it required enormous tactical skill to get this campaign operating and to build it, which Ernie was absolutely at the center of. I would say that campaign has had an impact on what the left in Britain does and how it operates right up until this day. Still very important. On the Palestine demonstrations that Tariq was talking about in London, two big ones. The Stop the War Coalition has been very important, but the Stop the War Coalition is inspired and follows in the tradition of the Vietnam Solidarity campaign. Pioneer Book Service in Toynbee Street was also an import agency for important strands of liberation politics, which the British left was largely ignorant of at that time, and especially from North America. And I'm referring especially to what we described at the time as the woman question, and books by Evelyn Reed and others, which people today might be a little bit critical of the anthropology in those books, but nonetheless, they were books which raised the issue of women's liberation for the first time, but especially also of Black liberation and the work of Malcolm X. If you wanted to get books by Malcolm X, you went to Pioneer Book Service, especially because those books have been produced by the American SWP, and Ernie and Jess were central in running it. My path departed from Ernie and Jess in the late 60s when I went off to university, and regrettably, they had to go back to Canada for financial reasons. And I didn't meet them again until 2000 when they came to London on one of their cultural trips. And my partner, Kathy Loew, and myself got to know Ernie and Jess much, much better. And the scope of their cultural interests. And people have referred, especially Bryan, but Judy and others have referred to how Ernie, being a revolutionary socialist and a Marxist, fed into a wide range of cultural interests. And this involved, yes, the London theatre, which they loved opera, bird watching, traveling all over Latin America, and their cottage on the Bruce Peninsula in the 100 acres that they were allowing to go back to nature. And Ernie very proudly showed me a beaver's dam in the middle of the mosquitoes, which in Canada are something special. But that cottage, that amazing cottage, that the architect of that cottage was Ernie Tate, the structural engineer was Ernie Tate, and the builders were Ernie Tate and Jess Mackenzie. An enormous achievement and indicative of the breadth of practical skills that Ernie had. And the whole Bruce operation was indicative of a practical commitment which Ernie and Jess had by then of the struggle for the environment and to save the environment against climate destruction. But Ernie and Jess, after 2000, after I met them again in 2000, it's strange to meet people again after 31 years. They never gave up their interest and their activity in revolutionary socialism. I want to mention especially their visits to Britain. Ernie and Jess were very strong supporters of the Scottish Socialist Party. We've got Richie Venton speaking here today. They went to several Scottish Socialist Party conferences. They came to Socialist Alliance and Socialist Resistance conferences in London as well. But I would say Ernie, in looking at the British left, was really wondered after in 2001, I think it was 2001, 2002, we went together to the Socialist Alliance Trade Union Conference. It was a very big affair, mainly because of the participation of the Socialist Workers' Party, maybe over 1,000 people. And Ernie wondered why the different left groups were so split up, just like they had been, like Tariq described in the 1960s, was still the case in Britain today. He was always for the maximum unity, maximum solidarity, maximum support for the struggles of the oppressed, and maximum support for internationalism. I want to end by, this was a joint journey, a joint project every step of the way. And we salute Ernie and we salute Jess today. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Carolyn Egan. Carolyn is a member of the steering committee of the International Socialists, the president of the United Steelworkers Toronto Area Council, and a founding member of the Ontario Coalition for Abortion Clinics. Please welcome Carolyn. And Carolyn, please go ahead.
Well, I first met Ernie through Jess during the organizing of the 1978 Rally and March for International Women's Day in Toronto. The Revolutionary Workers League, which they were both leading members, played an instrumental role in renewing this important tradition that was, of course, begun by socialist women celebrating the struggles of working class fighters in the garment industries in the early 1900s, and it still maintains today with bringing thousands into the streets. Jess was one of the organizers, and Ernie supported her every step of the way. I was struck then and continue to be struck by the depth of their relationship, the abiding love and mutual respect they had for each other, which showed in everything they did. It was a true partnership steeped in their commitment to one another, a deeply shared vision of a new world, and the understanding that their role was to be part of the struggle which was necessary to win that world. As Ernie wrote in his autobiography so many years later, Jess and I, and he didn't say I, it was Jess and I, to this day consider ourselves to be revolutionary socialists. We continue to participate whenever we can in promoting fundamental change in our society. The impression that I had of Ernie from our first conversation was his profound respect for the working class, not only as a vehicle for revolutionary change, which of course it is, but a respect for the individuals who make up the class, an empathy and understanding of the hard lives lived, the day-to-day struggle to maintain one's dignity, the incredible courage shown by those who stand up and fight back against the ravages of capitalism, the exploitation and the oppression it maintains. No doubt, part of this was his background growing up in very poor working class Belfast, seeing every day the real suffering that his family and neighbors went through. I was also struck very early on that even before becoming a socialist, Ernie, as a young man, saw through the divide, the sectarian divide in the north of Ireland. He did not accept the orange card that was being played by the British ruling class, fomenting the divisions between the Protestant Catholic communities that had been going on for centuries and kept them both exploited. For me, brought up in an Irish Catholic family, being part of the Irish Republican movement in my youth, meeting a Protestant worker who rejected the politics of sectarianism, it brought a tremendous hope for the future and reinforced the understanding that Marxism gives, that we can break through the differences that divide us and build a united working class movement. Things are different in Ireland today, but in the late 1970s, Ernie certainly made that a concrete reality for me and helped, along with, of course, other influences, cement in me a lifelong belief in the possibility of change. His and Jess's willingness to put the needs of the movement before their own showed their extraordinary commitment to the struggle. Moving to the UK, as people have mentioned, working for the Fourth International with barely enough money to survive, grueling cross-country tours, and so many other examples. When Ernie asked me to be master of ceremony for the launch of his autobiography, I was very honored to do so. Though I was a Trotskyist, I had never been a member of the Fourth International. And I remember Jess, and Jess reminded me at that event on one of the many adventures we had in the abortion rights campaign together, trying to recruit me on a bus going to heaven knows where to the, I think it was the RWL, talking about the need for a revolutionary organization. It didn't happen at that time, but then years later, as an activist in the women's movement and the United Steelworkers, I eventually did join this International Socialist. But no matter, he wanted me to play that role at his book launch, which spoke to his lack of sectarianism, which many have mentioned. In preparing for that event, I remember reading a paragraph in one of the volumes of his autobiography in which he wrote, in the spring of 1955, he had been walking down Yonge Street and came across the Toronto Labour bookstore, and it changed his life. And as he said, I was a young, unsophisticated, class-conscious worker who knew virtually nothing about socialism. That day, a door opened for him, and he walked through it and became a committed activist in the Trotskyist movement. He went on to say that for a young person, the realization that the economic system of capitalism is not humanity's normal existence, but only a stage in the historical development of society, was absolutely intoxicating. And I was quite taken by the word, intoxicating. And he went on to write, this is the true power of Marxism. It enables workers to make their own history and that they carry on their shoulders the future of humanity. And as hard as it can be to build a revolutionary organization or movements for change, it never seemed that he felt that as a burden with all the ups and downs that he encountered, because that intoxication, as he called it, never seemed to have left him. And in my view, what a wonderful way to live one's life, particularly with a soulmate like Jess. He had his own ideas for sure, and was always up for a good debate. He and Jess, every once in a while, attending forums of the International Socialists over the years, they were never sectarian. He certainly held his own, and you knew when he disagreed with you and exactly why. And whether he was attending meetings of the International Socialist or the Workers' Assembly, he was always, always friendly on the other ventures that we were involved in. And whether he was in or out of the organized left, his commitment to building for change was always there. In a workplace, as a union activist, or in the many united fronts he was instrumental in, Fair Play for Cuba way back, the anti-Vietnam War movement, or the anti-privatization campaign of QP1 at Toronto Hydro, where he was a member of the union executive. And it turned out to be a major blow to the neoliberal agenda and one of the few victories in the union movement we had in those days in this province. My good friend Rob Fairley, I'm sure, will speak to that in more detail. I want to keep my remarks short, and there are many more to speak, but in my eyes, Ernie was a true working class hero. He never wavered from a commitment to the struggle for the new world that we were all striving for, and he has really, truly left a remarkable legacy. And I can only assume that he would suggest to us today to carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. And Jess, thank you very, very much for asking me to participate today.
Our next speaker will be Barry Sheppard. Barry is a longtime socialist author and activist living in the San Francisco Bay Area. He is the author of The Party, a 2-volume first-hand account of the Socialist Workers' Party. Barry, please go ahead.
Jess said about bird watching reminded me of the time that Jess and Ernie came to visit me and Carolyn Lund in the San Francisco area, and we walking along the beachfront of the bay, how they pointed out all the different birds. Leaving it at that, I'm going to concentrate my remarks on the last 2 chapters of Ernie's book, 2nd volume, because the lessons that Ernie draws from them need repetition. They are about the World Congress of the Fourth International that occurred just before Ernie and Jess were to leave Britain and go back to Canada in the spring of 1969. There was an important turn at that Congress towards orienting towards rural guerrilla warfare in Latin America. Now, the background of this was 1968. That is which was a tremendous year in the world revolution. One was a big step forward that affected the whole anti-war movement, which was one of the sparks of the youth radicalization of that time. And that was the Tet Offensive, led by the Vietnamese, which stunned the world because it to the extent that it pushed back the United States armies. Even though it was eventually defeated, it changed the anti-war movement in the United States because it showed that it was that there was no light at the end of the tunnel, as Johnson used to say, but that the war was not being won by the United States. And that the second thing that happened that year was an anti-Stalinist uprising in Czechoslovakia, known as the Prague Spring. And the third important event was the May-June uprising in France, where our young comrades of our section in France played a leading role in organizing and the first stage of that movement, which was a student uprising around the Vietnam War, which was then attacked by police. And eventually that led to one of the greatest general strikes in history and the occupation of factories throughout France, a pre-revolutionary situation. So as we went into the spring of 1969 World Congress, it was a mood of great optimism and uplifting. However, and at that conference, Ernie and Jess were present, and I and Carolyn Lund were present. And so a big difference developed, which centered around the turn to organizing guerrilla warfare in Latin America, which led to a big defeat for the International and setback for many years. The line was that all the sections in Latin America should orient towards rural guerrilla warfare for an extended period. The political line that buttressed this was that democratic openings in Latin America were excluded. Military dictatorships, and of course there were many, would prevent any really mass work in the cities and in the unions. And therefore, the only thing that we should do is begin to organize rural guerrilla warfare on a continental line. This orientation and the idea that small groups or foci could spark a revolution by going into the countryside, organizing the peasantry into rural guerrilla war, would eventually lead to a revolution. It was a misunderstanding of the whole development of the Cuban Revolution. Ernie, in this chapter, describes how this bypassed something that Ernie stood for, and I did too, which was the need to build revolutionary organizations, a party building approach, that you could bypass that through this strategy. Also, there was no regard for the size of our sections, how well they were implanted in the working class or the peasantry. which made the whole thing having a whole utopian, unreal reality to it. And by the way, James, tell me when I have 1 minute left of my 5. I don't want to go over. This turned out to be wrong on every aspect. One, there were periods of democratic openings and big mass movements and big work that could be done in the trade union in the period that followed.
Barry, you're at the 1 minute left, please.
Okay. Okay, I can't go into everything that goes in about this, but the mood in the this Congress swept the whole, resulted in a majority line. People like Ernie and myself and others resisted it, and it led to disasters. At the Congress, the line presented most clearly by one of the leaders of the Fourth International, Livio Maitan, was that the next World Congress would be held in Bolivia, and that the orientation was towards a rural guerrilla struggle in Bolivia. That was smashed by the Bolivian army in just a few weeks after the World Congress, and the comrades were arrested. However, there was a big mass upsurge right then, big enough so that those comrades were freed from prison who had been arrested and made that error. Okay, I'll just jump over to the second chapter, which concentrates on how this developed in Argentina following the fiasco in Bolivia. And Ernie gives a detailed description, more than I knew, and he says more than he knew at the time, of the horror of what happened in Argentina attempting to implement this line, which resulted in the deaths of a whole hundreds of young revolutionary fighters who tried to carry out this line, and which led into a terrible, terrible bloodbath. I would just want to end with how Ernie ends this chapter on Argentina. The human toll taken by the political errors of the Fourth International, particularly in Latin America during this period, should be documented and learned from. That is why I have gone to some extent to recount this history of Argentina. I'll leave it at that.
Our next speaker is going to be Peter Boyle. Peter has been a socialist activist since the early 1970s and has been active around war, race, and class issues, including a long involvement in the Aboriginal rights movement. Peter is a member of Socialist Alliance in Australia and writes regularly for the newspaper Green Left Weekly. Peter has recorded his remarks by audio, and I'll pass it over to Tanner to play his remarks now. Thanks, Tanner.
Solidarity greetings from the other side of the planet, from your comrades in the Socialist Alliance in Australia. Most of us are from subsequent generations of comrades to Ernie. Many comrades from earlier generations here having passed or dropped back from political activism. We've tried to keep going at our work, putting out our weekly newspaper Green Left, trying our best to keep up with the digital media age, building the movements of resistance to capitalism, educating comrades in Marxist ideas, and learning from new revolutionary movements. And through all this, we have been in touch with and encouraged along by a small group of revolutionary aunts and uncles in Canada, one of whom was Ernie Tate. I hope these comrades don't mind us describing them this way, but I cannot think of a better way to describe the deep comradely love, appreciation, and respect we have for them. Any revolutionary who keeps up the fight for 65 years deserves great respect. but there's a special respect that's due to comrades who keep up the hard slog for so long in countries like Canada and Australia, wealthy, liberalish, junior imperialist states. We share the frustrations of having to work in small revolutionary groups when what we are trying to build are mass revolutionary parties of the working class. So when we see comrades like Ernie keep up the struggle for a lifetime without succumbing to sectarianism or demoralization, and determined to take whatever step, no matter how small, to advance the struggle, that truly inspires and deserves a special respect. Vale, Ernie Tate. May there be many more comrades like you.
Our next speaker will be Patrick Bond. Patrick is a Belfast-born socialist who has been based in South African social movements and universities since 1990. He got to know Ernie and Jess during the early 2000s when he was on a sabbatical leave at the Department of Political Science at York University.
Thank you very much for allowing me into the house. To be with all of you at the moment is a great honor because I can see the strength and the goodwill, the memories that I, in a very small way, would share. Certainly, Toronto has hearts and minds of people like myself. The way that York University poli-sci with, I see, Sam, Greg, the great late comrade Leo Panich, inviting so many of us, and we would be so thrilled in those seminars. But it was in the streets, in Bloor Street, it was in the meetings where I would see Ernie and Jess, and it was when Ernie and Jess said to me, just coming after one talk, that they'd like to bring me into their circle, that I was so thrilled. It was that generosity people have spoken about, and the warmth, the beauty of their relationship and their welcoming that I'll never forget. And indeed, that brings me to thinking about what an indie left kind of background, the socialist register and the sort of intellectual tradition I come from, has in common with Ernie, Jess, and all of you. And I'm ashamed, actually, because it was in February, just after Ernie passed on, that something very important happened when, in my own life, I was looking around in Ecuador and signed on to some petition that comrades there had supported an independent, eco-socialist, indigenous feminist project against the sort of center-left Keynesian extractivist politics. And I was just called in, I think it was called the gray zone, one of these, scurrilous, slightly, campus rags. A distinguished Trotskyite from South Africa, because I'd signed on. And it just struck me that, an Ernie who just passed on really represented the kind of traditions, the hard work, the balance, the commitment that I really want to have when I grow up. My father was born in Belfast in 1934, when Ernie was in working class Protestant communities, and my mum would have as well. Her Belfast-born father was in Burma, where she was born as a colonial officer. And I just think, as Peter Boyle said, in Toronto, my real aunts and uncles, my aunt and uncle of moving through traditions of this sort, are Jess and Ernie. So as we say here in Johannesburg, Amandla, away to power to the people. Hambakashle, go well, Ernie. Long live the spirit of Ernie Tate, long live. Thank you, comrades.
Our next speaker is Richie Venton. Richie is a founding member of the Scottish Socialist Party and its national trade union and workplace organizer. He was recently part of a successful campaign against IKEA in Scotland, following the company's retaliation against him for speaking out to defend workers' sick pay. Based in Glasgow, Richie has been a long-distance comrade and friend to Ernie and Jess over many years. Please welcome Richie. Richie, please go ahead.
Thanks, James. And I want to thank Jess for the privilege of being invited to speak tonight. Was tonight sort of for me, not just on my own behalf, but on behalf of the Scottish Socialist Party. On first meeting Ernie and Jess, roughly about 21 years ago, I immediately sensed kindred spirits. I suppose partly because Ernie and I shared that impoverished Northern Ireland background and our national origins and our determination to build working class unity and socialism set us off on a good footing, even though we travelled different routes to that journey. And also his deadly serious intent, his strength of opinions, but the warmth and kindness he held towards people shone out. And he also recognised, I think, the historic phase that we're living through, which required the building in particular of broad, inclusive, non-sectarian socialist parties, which we were trying to build up through the SSP, based above all on class and the struggle of the working class. And there was further evidence of during Ernie and Jess's visits to the SSP conferences and his insightful written reports from those events. He came across as a genuine friend of our project with a keen grasp of things, even though 3,500 miles away, a grasp that sometimes, unfortunately, comrades on the left in Britain didn't have. And his reports recognised and applauded our attempts at being inclusive, of cohesiveness around common socialist ideas and aims, of a non-sectarian approach, and with heavy emphasis in his reports on the work that we were doing within the organised workers' movement in Scotland. Ernie's undoubted talents in combining openness and sensitivity towards new movements, which others have referred to, of course, and the more traditional labour movement struggles are better known by others than by me, particularly comrades in Canada. But that is a combination, I think, that unfortunately too many people on the revolutionary left still fail to practice. But the authority that this revolutionary socialist, Ernie Tate, had carved out in the Canadian labour movement came across to me when, in collaboration with other comrades like Sam Gindin and others, he got me invited to speak on behalf of the SSP at the 2001 Congress of the Canadian Auto Workers Union. And that fly-in visit again led me to witness the man's many qualities. The warmth, the care, the welcome that I received in Ernie and Jess's home, almost like a long-lost son, even though I'm far too old to be a son, obviously. The whistle-stop tour around Toronto with explanations and running commentary, the intelligent conversation, even when I was suffering jet lag, and his delight at the Toronto meeting of the left on Scotland the night that I arrived, where his authority across the fractured left came across to me. Now, there's an old cliche that a friend in need is a friend indeed. And during the catastrophic split of the SSP, centered around a deeply flawed, egomaniacal individual who was our convener at the time, Ernie had a very rapid and accurate estimation of the situation. His friendly advice by email, that I dug out again there recently, his wise counsel, which I certainly think was wise because it corresponded, of course, with my assessment and the actions I was taking, all of that was invaluable. And even in our darker years of setback, when others had swallowed all the crap, and by the way, that was a word used in that same email by Ernie to me several times over 10 years ago, the crap about what had happened, he didn't flee, he didn't abandon the project to build a broad, inclusive, united socialist party in Scotland. He was supportive, he was encouraging, and alongside his partner and comrade, Jess, he was supportive in the most practical financial sense as well. Let me skip forward to late 2020, when tragically Ernie was severely ill. And two events occurred which summed up many of the things about the human being, as well as the revolutionary socialist that Ernie Tate was. One was the pride that I felt in hearing his devastating evidence to what we call the Spy Cops hearing in Britain. In his own sparse, piercing prose, pinning the state spies with incontestable evidence, still fearless and unapologetic, and quite rightly so, revealing some of the state activities that even somebody of my vintage was slightly too young to have lived directly through at the time of 68 and thereabouts. And the other event was his active interest, his encouragement and support as a friend and a comrade as I fought back against a multinational after being sacked by them for standing up for workers' rights, for workers' livelihoods and incomes, and indeed for their lives amidst the worst pandemic in a century. Jess told me at the time how inspired he was by the battle that we put up, the collective struggle that we're engaged in against a multinational, and their kindly support, including not only this, but including a Christmas hamper to my family being delivered from them. All of that was a genuine morale booster as a worker at the sharp end of the class struggle. It was internationalism made real and concrete and meaningful, and not just the annual May Day declamations that fake labour movement leaders come out with, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That wasn't Ernie. He was the opposite. And I conclude by saying that in Ernie's passing, I feel several things. I feel great loss of a long-distance friend, a comrade, and a wise ally. I feel regret at not having had far more regular contact over the 20 years or so that I knew him. The usual course of revolutionaries. We were far too busy. And above all, I feel pride and gratitude in having known this man. An honour, I feel of an honour in him having regarded me as a friend and comrade, of having been enriched by knowing the boy from Belfast who grew up in a street so poor that any family that was able to pay its rent on a regular basis for several months in a row would be visited by the police to check where the family got the money from. That was Ernie's background. And Ernie the boy became Ernie the man who left such an enduring impression on workers, on anti-war activists, on young people, on the revolutionary struggles for socialism in his adopted Canada, in Britain and beyond. This truly was a life well lived, lived for the greater cause of human liberation, a life worthy of celebration and of memorialization, a life shared with his beloved Jess, that she too must feel tremendous pride in having lived. I'm honoured to have been invited to say a few words about my dear departed friend and comrade. Thank you.
Our next speakers will be John Riddell and Suzanne Weiss. John and Suzanne are longtime revolutionary activists in Toronto. Suzanne recently published a memoir, Holocaust to Resistance, My Journey, and John has for several decades directed and contributed to the multi-volume Communist International Publishing Project. John and Suzanne, welcome. Please go ahead.
I heard of Ernie Tate in 1958 when I lived in the US. He was leading an effort to unite young socialist activists in a common organization. 3 years later, I was invited to a socialist cadre school in New Jersey where I met Ernie as a fellow student. Ernie stood out with his broad knowledge as an independent thinker and as an ace organizer. But we respected Ernie above all for his long experience as a worker. Although he was only 27, he had earned a living in production since the age of 14. He had an innate grasp of the working class and profound appreciation of the Marxist program for socialism. We, his younger companions in the cadre school, came to socialism as students and had much to learn from the living class struggle. Unfortunately, the cadre school curriculum was thin. Ernie acted to remedy the problem by organizing a program on the class struggle of the revolution in China, of interest to us all. Ernie also enlisted George Novak, an SWP educator, to speak to us about the philosophy of dialectical materialism. The school ended and Ernie returned to Canada. A few years later, Ernie was assigned to move to Europe to help unite our world socialist movement. After that, he went on to organize for many decades in the Canadian socialist and labor movement. I am so grateful to Ernie and Jess for documenting their experiences of those exciting times in the International and building the Canadian socialist movement. In their retirement, they continued to seek unity in the goal of a transition to a humane and just society. And today, we join in pursuing this goal. Thank you.
I met Ernie in the same year as Suzanne, 60 years ago. I knew him, first of all, as a trade unionist, a member of what soon became the League for Socialist Action. I was 18 at the time, a student activist in Toronto, part of a group of youthful League contacts. Ernie's rich working class experience gave him authority with us students. He also had a vast knowledge and understanding. He was a match for us on any topic. Ernie had a feel for the nascent social movements in which we young socialists were active. With his charm, his energy, and his generosity of spirit, and the wide reach of his thought, Ernie won many youthful contacts as friends and then as members of our Socialist League. Now, a year later, when Ernie was in that cadre school, I was living far away in Europe, quite alone, and I was buffeted by rival currents in the Fourth International, our world movement. At issue was the Cuban Revolution, of course. Ernie was for supporting the Cuban revolutionists and engaging with them. That was my view as well. He kept in touch with me through long handwritten letters. One of these currents attacked me over Cuba and formally ostracized me. Ernie wrote me supportively and pointed to the need for a broad view, the need to reach out in new directions. I have his letters still. There are differences in the International, Ernie wrote, but to most of our audience, these issues are not of interest and appear esoteric. They will be resolved around issues and struggles. We should look at who is coming toward us and not be overly concerned with maintaining our political virginity. Thank you very much.
The next speaker will be in the form of a video tribute by the Spring Socialist Network, of which I am a member. And I can let comrades know that in recent weeks, we formed a reading group to read Ernie's 2-volume memoir. And most of the comrades who are participating in this group have never actually met Ernie. And so we prepared this brief 5-minute tribute to let you comrades know what we are learning from his life lessons. So I'll hand it over to Tanner to play the video.
Remembering Ernie's life is a tribute to all of the socialists that have done this work, you know, for no fame or fortune or anything, but to keep the flame of like revolutionary socialism and, you know, just freedom and liberation and equality and whatnot burning and alive.
One line that I read, which I think is almost kind of identical to what I feel about our moment in 2021, but Ernie's writing about it for about the 60s. He writes, "A youth radicalization was sweeping the country with new forces appearing on the scene almost overnight, who might be won directly and rapidly to our ideas." And I feel the past year and the past week, because just last Saturday we went to the Palestine Solidarity demo, and I feel this generation and even people who are like 18 and 17, we're seeing so many of these organic leaders coming from the climate justice movement, from the Black Lives Matter movement, and the abolition movement. And I just feel that it's just a resurgence of that revolutionary politic that we had experienced in the 60s. And what this book can offer and is offering to me is actually learning the fault lines from the 60s, in which Ernie extensively discusses, and some of which Loretta had mentioned, the sectarianism and how the left should not be a barrier to progress. It should be the vessel to that progress, right? We need to keep building based on broad-based movements instead of creating these divides and divisions. And I think Ernie's political journey has something specific from that regard to offer to us organizing today.
I know Ernie had this thing, and I always liked hearing from him on this, which is just a commitment to teamwork, a commitment to organizing and building leadership in others, and putting the collective project of socialism, ahead of just like how you're feeling about stuff. And then also understanding that by doing that, you can transform the world, but you can also transform yourself.
That's why I appreciated the word you used, Dave, commitment, when you were talking about him, because I think that's what's really clear. That's what's really clear about him. And he's not committed to his own success. He's committed to the movement.
I was invited to read Ernie's book and join Ernie and Jess for a conversation in 2015. And I think of that conversation as it came at a really good moment for me, I think, in my own political development. And that conversation was part of my learning of why being part of a political organization was important, and the impact that being part of that collective project could have in the world, in the movements I was part of.
What was most striking to me about Ernie Tate was his resilience and his capacity to always spot opportunity, So he was able to always bounce back, right? And that's what more of the left needs, right? Because it's hard. There's, many defeats, there's many setbacks, lots of isolation, lots of hardship. But he just kept going, and he never let his spirits get down. He was able to ultimately write a giant memoir full of information, right? And so that if there was anything that struck me about this book, although the politics were very sharp, and as somebody who's new to the Canadian left specifically, I learned a lot coming into, learning about the past traditions. But what really struck me was, as somebody who'd never met the man, was his strength of character.
And so that's what I really appreciated about Ernie's work. He did this work many, many decades ago, and he probably didn't realize that his work would have a resounding effect many generations later for people from all over the world, including myself.
When I was reading Ernie's book, I was looking at more about him online, and I realized that today was his birthday. And I think it's really beautiful that there's so many members of Spring who are sharing today all of our experiences and all of the life lessons that we've learned from him.
Rest in power, Ernie Tate. Thank you for all you've done to help build a better world.
Rest in power, Ernie. Thank you for your lessons from a very young comrade.
Thanks, Ernie. Rest in power.
Rest in power, Ernie Tate.
Rest in power, Ernie.
Rest in power, Ernie Tate. And thank you so much for everything you've done.
Rest in peace, Comrade Ernie.
Rest in power, Ernie. Thank you for your life lessons.
Thanks to the Spring Comrades for that. Our next speaker is going to be Sam Gindin. Sam was research director of the Canadian Auto Workers from 1974 to 2000. Sam is co-author with Leo Panitch of The Making of Global Capitalism, Verso Press, and co-author with Leo and Steve Marr of The Socialist Challenge Today, the expanded and updated American edition published by Haymarket Books.
Thanks for the invite to speak, and especially for organizing this. I just met Ernie actually about 20 years ago. So for me, it's great to get this chance to hear more from people that are part of his past and speaking about that past. I have to say that whenever I go to one of these things honoring somebody, I always lament that they aren't here just to hear the appreciation for their contribution and their legacy. There's something about these kinds of events that we should probably think about doing them before the person dies, so they can actually see the depth of the appreciation. I worked with Ernie in the Socialist Project, and I'm going to be very general, and I just want to say how much the older comrades, like myself and like Leo and Greg, how much respect there was for his integrity, his wisdom, his sober common sense, his unquestioned commitment, his persistence, and his creative hope. That was crucial to us. But even more important was the fact that Ernie was a model for people who were just emerging comrades, as people in Spring said, who were grappling with, well, what does it really mean to be a socialist? And in this regard, the point about Ernie was what Bryan Palmer mentioned in the very first talk, that what's so important about Ernie was the totalizing vision. Ernie was the real thing. He brought everything together. He was a foot soldier and a leader. He was an activist and intellectual. He was a mentor and a listener. He was always challenging, but always supportive. He was proud, but he never presented himself as indispensable. He somehow managed to always balance patience and discipline with impatience. Let's get on with it. He could also balance the immediate and the long term, the politics of the small and the large. He was a reformer and a revolutionary. He was an internationalist, but he always understood that internationalism required building the base at home. He very much followed Marx in terms of saying the struggle is international in substance, which meant that whatever we do here affects the struggle internationally or undermines it elsewhere, but it's national in form. Organizing is always local, and it's against the employer, the boss, and the state. As people kept repeating, Ernie, and this is a crucial part of being a socialist, was a full human being. He was social, cultured, decent, and with Jess, he could really always say, we fight for bread, but we fight for roses too. He was a socialist in his bones, in his marrow, both physically and spiritually. What especially struck me in the Socialist Project was that he was a brilliant strategist. And, that came from his experience, and it came from him being smart and well-read, but it also came from a particular way of being and acting in a socialist and social context. When we got into strategic debates, what came through was his laser-sharp focus on what was at hand. He was not distracted by any kind of sectarianism or proving that a particular line got you to the right place. That fell to the wayside. There was never any grandstanding. He wasn't trying to show that he was smart, as smart as the academics or the brilliant students. He was focused on the task at hand. And he always listened when people challenged him and answered to the point. It was respectful, but always firmly. He wasn't just trying to make friends when he was getting into these arguments. And as so many people said, he so clearly understood that you had to organize around immediate needs. You couldn't organize without that, but it was always in the context of what does this have to do with building? What Ernie really left us with, and this is his legacy, he left us with hope. And he left us with hope in two ways. At a moment of demoralization and lowered expectations, having hope is absolutely critical. And Ernie was giving us hope in his brand of socialism. It was a socialism that was non-sectarian, which we've heard 100 times already, but you can't say it enough. It was non-mechanical. It wasn't just something that you could derive from contradictions. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't a matter of faith. It wasn't preordained. It was about a historical possibility. It was revolutionary optimism in the sense of the ability to imagine a different world, to learn how to strategize and understand, and how to organize to bring it to life. And the second way that he brought hope, and as a real legacy, and I really do feel like this is something that Ernie left me with, and left so many other people with, was his personal example, not just of a way of being, but of the fact that what the working class, and I think Palmer said this in an article in Dimension, is capable of at its best. We saw the potentials of the working class at its best, and not just the working class, I guess, of all of us at our best. And so it was an honor to meet him, but that honor didn't end with his death. It's going to be what keeps so many of us going. That's Ernie's legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. That was a beautiful depiction of Ernie that I think all of us relate to. Our next speaker will be Rob Fairley. Rob Fairley worked at the Toronto hydroelectric system from 1972 to 1995 as a laborer and then as an electrician. He was active in the union, CUPE Local 1, during Ernie's years there and was president from 1987 to 1995. Since leaving Local 1, Rob has worked on many campaigns and strikes. He is retired Director of Strategic Services at the Toronto and York Region Labour Council. And just before I pass it over to you, Rob, I'll also jump in at the 1 minute mark left, just to let you know when you have 1 minute left. So Rob, over to you. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Jess. It's an honor to speak at this memorial and tribute to Ernie. Can you imagine someone like Ernie Tate showing up in your workplace and in your union? Can you imagine what it's like all of a sudden to realize that you have a person of this quality and experience speaking at your local union meeting? That's what happened to me. He made a little slip. He called me at the mic. He said, I'd like to build on what the comrade brother just said. And then I thought, oh, I got to go and speak to this person. He was a leader of Local 1, CUPE Local 1 at Toronto Hydro. I worked there from 72 to 95, and after 16 years on the tools, I was elected president. And for several years, Ernie was vice president of Local 1 while I was president. We were literally shoulder to shoulder for a considerable period of time through many campaigns, wildcats, and a major strike. He was absolutely rock solid through all of that, as you can imagine. Many leaders from Local 1 that I've spoken to recently remember Ernie as a generous and supportive mentor. He was as patient in discussions with emerging militant leaders in the local as he was tough in debates on the left. I've written an article about Ernie's years at Local 1. I'm just plugging it here. You can find a link to it somewhere. Ernie and I hailed from very different left traditions, but we worked together very well and developed a close friendship that lasted over 45 years. During that time, I came to know his dynamic life partner and comrade, Jess Mackenzie. Jess and Ernie shared a tremendous passion for life and had a wide range of interests, including the arts, travel, and birding. Ernie was a hands-on fighter who did not turn his nose up at the day-to-day struggles of working people. There's going to be a little repetition in here, but we're all talking about the same person, so I think it's unavoidable. He was sharply critical of those on the left who believed that progress is possible without the often humbling hard work of real-world struggle. We shared the view that left cadres should be people useful to the working class in the here and now. Throughout his life, Ernie was not just thinking left politics, he was doing left politics. Ernie's eyes were wide open to the limitations of trade unionism, and he understood the crucial role of unions in society. He recognized unions as a place where left cadre can learn the trade craft of struggle. As a mature revolutionary, Ernie provided a steady hand on the tiller, and he embodied a left slogan of the 60s and 70s, dare to struggle, dare to win. He provided responsible leadership. He was able to be both impatient for revolution and patient enough to be relevant and effective in the present. And that is so important in the times that we live in now. To illustrate these qualities, I'm going to provide a couple of highlights of Ernie's role in Local 1's 1989 strike. I've trimmed my tail here. At the outset, it was Ernie who convinced the local leadership that in order to crack a lousy wage settlement pattern, we had to go big with our wage demands. So we proclaimed that it was time for double digits, and we waged a very militant strike. But after more than a month on strike, progress at the negotiating table had stalled. We were not entirely surprised. Toronto Hydro was under intense pressure from the highest levels to keep the lid on us. Our modest-sized local set the pattern for the public sector across the province. So at this juncture, Ernie had another piece of important advice for us. This time, it was about ending the strike. We won't improve our position by staying out longer, he told us. We are at the peak of our power. We should wrap up the strike on the best possible terms and get ready for the next round in 2 years. His advice was strategic and wise. Ernie was not driven by a romantic left need for glorious combat. We reluctantly took Ernie's advice, put on a major show of force, and trimmed our demands. We quickly nudged the hydro up to 14% over 2 years and settled. Thanks to Ernie's leadership, the local emerged united, and a new generation had developed a taste for struggle. We had reasserted our power at Toronto Hydro and laid the groundwork for major victories in the years that followed. A 37.5-hour work week for 40 hours pay, a successful challenge to Hydro's racist hiring policies, a groundbreaking anti-harassment policy, and breakthrough coverage for all terms and conditions of the collective agreement for members with so-called same-sex partners. That was in 1993. Adoption leave, bereavement leave, everything. So much for the assertion that work in unions is a lesser endeavor, inherently confined to economic pocketbook issues. Shortly before he retired in 95, shortly after he retired in 95, Ernie helped to establish the Ontario Ernie helped to establish the Ontario Electricity Coalition, which defeated Mike Harris's attempts to privatize Ontario Hydro.
And just 1 minute left, Rob. Go ahead.
Thank you. We were thinking big and bold. That province-wide campaign was led by Local 1, a municipal hydro local, not the huge union at Ontario Hydro. I'm going to just conclude by saying this. Ernie's great strength was that he brought the same rigor to left organizing that he brought to left intellectual work. It was said that he has no regrets, but he did have a major disappointment. He was deeply disappointed that we were unable to build a big non-sectarian left tent in Toronto, despite repeated efforts. He was deeply disappointed that we never fully evaluated why we had failed in this. And I believe that we can best honor Ernie by rededicating ourselves to that challenge. That's what we have to do. It's just not good enough. Ernie lasted longer in that effort than me. He was truly tireless. So I have a pain in my chest. I miss him terribly. And my condolences to everyone who loved him dearly as I did. Thank you.
Our final speaker before we hit the home stretch will be Pam Frache. Pam is an organizer with the Workers' Action Center, the provincial coordinator of the Justice for Workers campaign, which many of you might know as the Fight for 50 and Fairness, and a member of the Spring Socialist Network. Pam, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. And what an honor for me to be part of this incredible lineup of fighters that have come before me. I got to know Ernie about 20 years ago during the New Politics Initiative, a time when the anti-globalization movement was gaining momentum here and around the world. It was a very exciting time. Climate justice, anti-privatization campaigners, movements for Indigenous sovereignty, and the labor movement were converging in a way that called into question not only the pro-business policies that had marked the previous 3 decades, but the very logic of capitalism on a global scale. The New Politics Initiative was an attempt to transform the NDP into a party more closely and deliberately linked to this emerging social movements of the day, an effort, I suppose, to be building the kind of mass non-sectarian party that the previous speaker spoke of. That Ernie would be active in the NPI, of course, is not at all surprising, given the leadership role Ernie played in preventing the wholesale privatization of Ontario Power. And indeed, as so many tributes today have underscored, Ernie's acute sense of possibilities and potential for working class action were his trademark. It was also completely consistent that Ernie would have been on the front lines of the NPI, given his experience in helping to organize and shape the transformation of the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, into the NDP. I remember at the time being both amazed with and inspired by stories that Ernie shared about how in those days, it was not uncommon for CCF organizers to head down to a local picket line and sign up striking workers right on the spot. I got to know Ernie as a principled and committed revolutionary socialist with a sharp sense of strategy and tactics, and one who was always honest and always clear in arguing what needed to be done. I also came to know him as someone who took every single person seriously and on face value, including myself. Over the years, Ernie lent me many books, and on one occasion, I had a chance to lend him a book that he didn't already have. Although I must say, upon delivering it, he was rather appalled to discover my habit of using an ink pen to mark up the pages of my books. During this time, I also got to know Jess and was likewise inspired by her leadership. I was especially captivated by her recollections of the socialist feminist movement in Toronto in the 1970s and the many prominent women who were part of it, and many are on this call today. The movement also included Rita McNeil, who I learned had been quite shy, but would nonetheless sing at the end of socialist feminist meetings. Her first album, Born a Woman, was launched in 1975 with the support and encouragement of these socialist feminists like Jess. More recently, Ernie and Jess have been active in the decent work movement led by the Workers' Action Center. Although the Workers' Action Center is not a traditional union, it is like a union insofar as it's a union of non-union workers who are in precarious jobs. Ernie and Jess immediately understood the importance of the fight for 15 and fairness. In particular, they recognized the significance of forging a multiracial working class movement to raise the floor of wages and working conditions for all workers. To me, Ernie and Jess, and all socialists who engage each other in good faith, constitute the red thread that runs from the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution right through to the present day. There's absolutely no doubt they embody the best of the Trotskyist movement and anti-Stalinist traditions of socialist organizing. Indeed, when I read about the political debates that characterize the socialist movement in Russia, I'm struck at how those revolutionary leaders argued passionately while also listening carefully with the intent not only of persuading, but also of being persuaded themselves of the best way forward. To me, that is significant, and speakers have alluded to this, because in addition to Ernie's passion, determination, clarity, and sense of possibility, he also embodied a profound sense of modesty. It's a modesty that I believe comes from a deep political understanding that revolutionaries are part of a larger international working class project. A modesty that understands revolutionaries must not only share lessons from the past, but also learn from present struggles. And I think that's why Ernie was so keen to engage young people, so keen to engage activists who were themselves engaged in struggles and to hear their take and their assessment of the situation. I want to close by drawing on a concept I first learned from the Domestic Workers Alliance, and in particular from Black domestic workers who talk about their ancestors. They aren't talking about genealogy. They're talking about their political ancestors. What kind of political ancestor do we want to be? What lessons do we want to share? How do we hope to be remembered? This concept has led me to think about my own political ancestors. I think about the people who always spoke the truth, people who did what they believed to be right, even though it wasn't always welcomed or popular. People who were relentless fighters for a better world, and people who see potential everywhere and in everyone. People like Ernie Tate. So when I think of the political ancestor I want to be, I think of Ernie. Thank you, Ernie, for the path you made and for the path yet to come. Ernie Tate, presente.
I think that summarizes how many of us feel on the call about Ernie's contribution to all of us and the special moments of time we've had with him in all our political work and development. So thank you for that, Pam. And just before we get to the end, I'm going to read a couple of contributions from comrades who couldn't be here today. The first contribution is from Ian Burchall. Ian's a Marxist historian and translator based in London. He's a member of the London Socialist Historians Group, and he's the author of a biography of Tony Cliff, among many other articles and books. And he writes, "Dear comrades, I knew Ernie well during his time in London, and I know how important his contribution was to building the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, which had an enormous impact on the development of the British left. We had our differences. We came from different currents of the far left, but Ernie was always clear that building a united movement was our first priority. Ernie always put unity in action first. And in his remarkable autobiography, he is generous, even towards those he was in political conflict with. After he left London, I lost track of him for many years, so I was delighted when I found myself speaking alongside him in the 2014 meeting organized by Socialist Resistance. After that, we corresponded occasionally. He had lost none of the deep commitment that inspired his activism. Things are difficult for the left today, though there are signs of hope in such things as Black Lives Matter. The memory of activists like Ernie will be an inspiration to a new generation of fighters. All my very best wishes, Ian Burchall." The second tribute is by Norman Traub. Norman is a revolutionary socialist based in South Africa. He was a member of the Unity Movement of South Africa in the 1960s and a long-standing fighter against South Africa's apartheid regime. And he writes in his tribute, "Dear friends and comrades, I wish to express my heartfelt condolences to you on the death of Ernie Tate. He was an inspiring revolutionary, and Phil Hearse's tribute to him is testimony to the esteem felt by socialist resistance and left-wing circles for his and Jess's contribution to the struggle. On behalf of the comrades in South Africa and myself, I wish to record Ernie's great contribution to the unity movement of South Africa in the 1960s, when he was a leading member of the International Marxist Group and the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. I well remember when I.B. Tabata and Dora Taylor turned towards him when they were publicizing abroad the struggle of the oppressed workers and peasants in South Africa. Ernie never failed to assist them in their task, and I can remember them sending me on errands to the place where he worked to pick up leaflets, which he had reproduced for them. The African People's Democratic Union of Southern Africa, which was founded during the 1960s to represent the interests of the oppressed workers and peasants in South Africa, is carrying on that struggle for socialism. Once again, my heartfelt condolences on behalf of the UMSA and myself in your great loss. Yours fraternally, Norman Traub." So those are, thank you, Norman and Ian, for those really heartfelt remarks. I'm going to pass it over to Tanner, who's going to play a short 2-minute tribute from Linda Loew of Socialist Viewpoint in Chicago.
Hi, I'm Linda.
And I'm Guy. We come from a very small movement where there is at most maybe 2 or 3 degrees of separation between everyone who went through it in the 60s and 70s. So, of course, we both knew who Ernie was for 4 decades or so before we finally had a chance to meet him. And meeting a living legend like Ernie was a little intimidating at first. I think the intimidation lasted maybe 10 seconds when we met both Ernie and Jess, 2 people that were always a delight to be around. I think if he could build a movement, a party of 300,000 Jess Mackenzies and Ernie Tates, the days of greed and exploitation would be numbered. So I'm proposing our equivalent of the Nobel Prize. I'll call it the Working Class Hero. And I think I would nominate Ernie for the first recipient.
To hang out with Ernie and Jess, which we got to do in 3 cities, in Chicago, in New York, where we have mutual friends and comrades, and in Toronto, where they so graciously hosted us when we were visiting. To hang out with them wasn't just hanging out. It was a pleasure as well as an intellectual exercise. Ernie always wanted to push the boundaries on how we look at the past, present, and plan for the future. Not only with his 2 volumes, but in conversation and action. Ernie always welcomed a chance to push the struggle forward in all the movements the speakers have so beautifully described, and also within the many friendships that he helped to cultivate and enjoy. Ernie and Jess would stay on in Chicago for days sometimes beyond the conferences that brought them here. That gave us a chance to show them our highlights of Chicago. Well, they were troopers. They literally would walk for miles with us after our Chicago architecture cruise with them, talking all the while about everything under the sun, about the movement, sure, but also about travels and food and wine and every imaginable adventure, sharing stories and anecdotes. Ernie was a keen observer of the places they visited and the people they met. There was always a lesson, a kernel of an idea to explore. We cherish those special memories, including on their turf in Toronto. Jess, we look forward to many more such times with you. And we salute Ernie. He was a model of embracing life and the struggle and living it to the fullest. Thanks.
It really has been a moving event to see how many people from all over the world want to make contributions and have prepared such thoughtful and heartfelt remarks for Ernie and shared with them the impact of his politics and organizing on all their lives. So thank you, comrades, for all those thoughtful contributions. I think we can move into the final part of the program this afternoon. And this last part is a 3-minute slideshow. And there are 2 parts to the slideshow. You'll quickly see the first 2-minute part is going to be a series of images from Ernie's life of politics. And thank you to Jess and Tanner for providing these and organizing these into the sequence. And you will notice that the voiceover for this is Ernie talking a little bit about his experiences. Remarks were taken from the book launch in 2014, the Toronto book launch, which I know many comrades and friends here attended. And then the second part of this slideshow is actually a clip of Ernie speaking at the end of that book launch in 2014. So we are hoping that we can end today's event the same way we did beginning it with Ernie. So I'll pass it over to you, Tanner, to kick off the slideshow.
Some of you may have seen me wiping my eyes. I wasn't crying. As you get a certain age, you can sometimes get dry eyes and you tend to tear. So I was wiping those tears. Not to say that I'm not moved by what was said here tonight. I tell you the truth, I didn't expect any of this, and I didn't expect the response the book received. In fact, when I was writing the book, I was my main motivation, method when I was writing the book was determined really by something I'd read from E.H. Carr, who was a great close contemporary of Isaac Deutscher, who Isaac Deutscher knew well, and Carr became a Marxist in the probably Bryan knows this better than I do. He became a Marxist in the process of writing his famous History of the Russian Revolution. But I'm saying this to you now because it's very important we all think of it, and that is Carr's famous statement was, very often the history is made by the people who write it. And very often the people who write our history are our opponents. Are our opponents who are hostile to our ideas, who want to demoralize us. Very important to keep that in mind, which is why we have to write our history. Really why. And so I'm hoping some of you comrades here, when you read this, you'll say, you know, I think I could do that. And maybe even a little bit better. Maybe even a little bit better. Let me just end by saying, for me, I've had this discussion several times. Jess is telling me to shut up there. I've had this discussion many times. For me, this has been a joyous experience. My comrade Bryan talked about sacrifice. I never ever considered this sacrifice. This is what I wanted to do. And that's a glorious thing, to do the things you want to do. So many working people are stuck at jobs, are at a total dead end, don't know what to do. We as revolutionary Marxists are doing things we want to do. And I think that's a glorious and an optimistic thing to do. So that's the last message I give you this evening anyway. Thank you.
Well, so thank you, Ernie, for those remarks. I think all of us are probably feeling quite moved by the words he had to say in those clips, in light of how much they echo all the beautiful tributes we've heard from comrades and friends this afternoon. And we know that there will be many more tributes coming to Ernie, not just in the days and weeks ahead, but in fact in the years ahead, as a new generation of fighters discover his life lessons, his work, his 2-volume memoir, and are inspired, like so many of us on the call, by all the things he stood for and all the things he did. So thank you, Ernie, as so many of the comrades and friends have said on the call today. So we're almost at the end of the program, and what I'd like to do is just make a few more thank yous before we wrap things up. So first of all, thank you to all the speakers who joined us from all over the world, and for your really thoughtful, heartfelt, moving tributes. We really appreciate that you could join us today, and for everything you put into those comments that really made this a special event today. We certainly thank all the participants, all of you. We had at one point, I think 160 or 170 participants, again, from all over the world. So thanks for making time on your Sunday afternoon to join us for this really important event. It's so amazing to be with so many people from so many backgrounds and experiences and generations, and celebrating the life of Ernie and sharing all the different ways that he's inspired us to be revolutionary socialists today. So thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers of the event today. Again, the Socialist Project, the Center for Social Justice, Spring Magazine, Socialist Resistance, Green Left Weekly, and Socialist Viewpoint. Thank you for all your work in organizing the event today. A huge round of applause should go to Tanner Merlis, who held down the technical aspect of the event today. So all the videos, all the audio, all the things in the chat, that was Tanner's doing today. So thank you, Tanner, for making this event possible. Obviously, a huge heartfelt thanks to Jess Mackenzie. Lots of love and solidarity to you from all the comrades, all the friends on this call, for everything that you did to make this event possible. We love you and Ernie, and we're so happy that we were able to be a part of this event today. I'll just conclude by saying so much of what I heard today echoes what my own experience was of meeting and knowing Ernie. I feel as if since I moved to Toronto in 2001, I have been meeting Ernie many times over the 20 years and learning so much about his life. And as many people have said, he was so modest and unassuming about all the things that he did. It was amazing to hear the anecdotes that he shared and to read his memoirs and to see the way he really did change the course of history with so many comrades of his generation who came before us and who indeed have helped shape the political moment that we're all in now. So thank you all for participating. We're going to close with something that I think all of you will find fitting and appropriate. We're going to play the Internationale, which is the hymn to workers' struggle and to the fight for working class emancipation.
Here we go.
Arise, ye workers, from your slumbers. Arise, ye prisoners of want. For reasons in revolt now thunders, and at last ends the age of cant. Away with all your superstitions, survive masses, arise, arise. We'll change henceforth the old tradition, and spurn the dust to win the prize. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. Comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. More deluded by reaction, on tyrants only will make war. The soldiers too will take strength action, they'll break the ranks and fight no more. And if those cannibals keep trying to sacrifice us to their pride, they soon shall hear the bullets flying. We'll shoot the generals on our own side. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. Comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. No savior from on high delivers, no faith we have in prince or peer. Our own right hand the chains must shiver, chains of hatred, greed, and fear. Air the thieves out with their booty, and give to all a happier lot. Each act of forge must